Hello, I'm Howard Johnson, your host for today's episode of WTW's Pensions Perspective podcast. We're recording today after our Pensions and Saving Conference, and I'm here with Glyn Bradley from our research team, who has just actually presented to our guests at the conference about today's budget, which will be the topic of conversation for us on our episode today. Glyn, welcome.
Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you do at WTW?
Yeah, I'm Glyn Bradley. I'm an actuary in the Pensions Technical Unit, and that means we look at all the regulatory and legal and things developments, news and so on coming out of government and the world of pensions and budgets. We love a budget, love a good fiscal event, because what the public see is the speech when the Chancellor stands there and the Deputy Speaker tells everyone to be quiet.
A very rowdy House of Commons.
And we take some notes in that. It's normally a good time to eat your sandwiches, but not a lot happens. The real excitement for us, if you can call it that, is when the Chancellor sits down. We then wait for all the hundreds and hundreds of pages to go online. And that's the bit that's when we spend our afternoons going through all of that, trying to find the bits that are relevant for pension schemes and to try and make sense of that as quickly as we can for everybody and get the information out. Now, today's a great challenge because at 3:30, I was on stage with all our clients trying to brief them on what we just seen. A little bit easier for us this year with the Office of Budget Responsibility, MOLE, publishing their report before the Chancellor had even started. So that gave us a real head start
that preview.
we don't normally have.
Okay, brilliant. So I'm just pleased that other actuaries enjoy that kind of stuff. I'll stick to my spreadsheets. I guess first question is, there's been a lot of noise around the budget. It seems like more than ever in newspapers and online about things that have been trailed and I think kite flying. What were some of the things that were speculated about beforehand, particularly about pensions?
There were so many, and there were suggestions of income tax going up and national insurance going down. There's speculation every single budget about tax-free cash. There's always a bit of speculation around tax relief and whether it continues to carry on as it has done. And spoiler alert, it has, and it probably will do for most years because it's very hard to change the tax relief we have.
Yeah, I think quite a lot of relief from the market that those things haven't changed. I know my parents are sort of both fearful of those kind of things coming in. I suppose, in terms of what's actually happened then, in terms of the headlines, how did that compare to what was expected?
So, as I say, no change in tax-free cash this year. Salary sacrifice has been the one that's been hit in the world of pensions. We have effectively a £2,000 cap on how much you can sacrifice of your salary for pension contributions and get the full tax advantages out of that. And there are a few other pension headlines as well. Yeah.
I'm just going to look at your slides here, which are actually from the presentation you did earlier, and we'll sort of talk through those. So if we talk through, we'll come back to salary sacrifice and sort of unpack some of that. There's a few other aspects here. I think some we thought might come and some that we perhaps didn't expect. First of all, I think the point about DB surplus being payable directly to scheme members.
This was news to us. This wasn't one that was, I think, particularly trailed in advance, and schemes that are looking to use surplus are going to be quite interesting in this one. What the government said is that from 2027, there will be a way in which schemes can make surplus payments directly to members, providing they're old enough to get a pension, which is quite interesting, because if you're trying to distribute a bit of surplus to your members, you might want to give it to everybody, but this is saying actually no, you're going to have to be 57 to get that.
Are we thinking that rather than an addition to their pension, I guess the sort of typical way that you'd see a discretionary benefit being given, are we expecting cash payments to be what people are interested in here?
Yeah, I think in terms of what schemes can do, they're heavily constrained by HMRC rules as to how they give benefits to members. And if there's a little bit of surplus, and government's interested in this because, of course, it wants schemes to keep going and invest in the economy. And the question then is, well, what's the upside for members of doing that? Surplus payments of some sort are the way to do that. If you give somebody a little bit of extra pension for life, it's probably a fairly small amount relative to what they're already getting. And of course, it takes many years for that to come through. If you can give them a lump sum here and now, there's a very definite impact for those members. And trustees might therefore find it more worthwhile and in members' interest to carry on running the scheme on and investing, taking certain investment risks and so on.
Yeah.
We'd have no details at all on as of sort of this afternoon as to where that will go, but I'd expect it to be some sort of HMRC consultation, creating a new kind of authorised payment that schemes are allowed to make to back that up.
Yeah, yeah. So April 2027, we'll keep an eye on that one and keep clients updated.
Yeah.
We've then got the PPF, so a bit of a diversion from this mostly one-size-fits-all approach. They're looking at giving pension increases on pre-97 benefits where currently those benefits don't receive any increases, and they're looking at giving them some sort of indexation. Do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, well, this debate's been rattling around a while because the PPF is in such a strong position financially now. They don't need more levies.
Yeah.
And the question has come up what to do with the surplus, because this was never really nailed down at the outset. What would happen if this day ever came? I guess it always seemed a very long way away. And back in my career, looking back at 2004 when all this kicked off, it did look a very long way away. The people who went into the PPF and indeed into the financial assistance scheme, so there were those are the people, if you like, that would have gone into the PPF had it existed at the time, and were topped up because their pension schemes had failed. They don't get increases on their pre-1997 benefits, and that's been a big sore point with pensioners who in many cases have lost out.
And for a lot of pensioners, that will be a significant chunk of their pension, especially those who went in the sort of the early noughties.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these people have retired 20 years ago, and inflation over that time has really eaten away at their pension.
Yeah.
This is saying we have the surplus to do it. If you would have had increases in your scheme, then the PPF will start to pay those increases going forward. I do think there's some big practical problems around that, and some pensioners are going to be disappointed. We know a lot of schemes had a discretion to give increases on their pre-1997 pensions, but there were no guarantees. It looks like they're not going to get increases here because the PPF is trying to compensate for the rights that people had, not what would have happened had everything have gone well. Interesting challenge, I think, looking back for both the PPF and the FAST schemes, is actually trying to work out which members were entitled to increases and what increases going back, because we're talking about schemes that have wound up or transferred to the PPF.
Interesting what paperwork still exists and what some of these members might be able to dig out of their closets if they were sent booklets and the like. I guess related to that point, this won't be backwards looking, will it? Because I guess there's a question here of people who, if they've only got a pre-97 pension from the PPF, inflation's been very high in recent years, their income really has dropped compared in real terms. But this will only be a forward-looking thing from the sounds of it.
My understanding is it's increases going forwards.
Yeah.
But no doubt there will be suggestions and pressure to do something more generous.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good news story. And when's that coming in from?
2027.
Yeah, relatively soon. Great. Okay. I think just the last one, a fairly sort of tricky topic: inheritance tax treatment. Should we we'll cover that one briefly?
This is going back to the last budget, which we haven't really finished dealing with yet. It sounds like a sort of dry administration impact, but it is going to affect death benefits for pension scheme members, particularly in DC schemes, to a considerable extent. The Chancellor announced that they were going to bring pension schemes into the inheritance tax regime. And by that, what they're looking at there is to target the unspent pots. Because there has been in some courses a deliberate strategy of people parking their money into drawdown or not drawing it on it at all, and passing that on inheritance tax free to the generations. The government's wised on to that, but it has taken a fairly broad approach that brings in a lot of what we might think of as fairly ordinary death benefits for fairly ordinary families. The proposals have moved around quite a lot over the last year or so. Originally, it put a lot of responsibility on pension schemes to calculate the inheritance tax.
I remember that.
We pushed back on that.
Okay.
The HMRC then came forward and put all the responsibility on personal representatives, the people that sort out the member's estate. They understandably pushed back on that.
So a bit of lobbying on either side.
Yeah, a bit of back and two. Where we seem to have landed on now is that the inheritance tax will be the main responsibility of the personal representatives, But looks like today's announcement is they will be given a power to say to the scheme, hold on to half your death benefits until I say so. And if necessary, we want you, the scheme, to pay some of that inheritance tax. Because what the personal representatives are really afraid of is that the schemes would just pay everything out to beneficiary without their involvement, which is what we can do today. And those people would spend the money or not pay it back to the personal representatives, who are the ones ultimately liable for the inheritance tax bill. Yeah. So it's finding a way through. I mean, I wouldn't have tried to put pensions into inheritance tax because of these kind of problems.
Yeah.
But that is something the government appears to be really wedded to.
Yeah. So a bit more of a burden on trustees and their administrators really in the future. And that's coming in 2027 as well.
It is. And I think we should also not forget the direct impact on ordinary families. I'm thinking particularly of children, of somebody that's died, and also unmarried partners. You know, they are not protected and they're not privileged by the inheritance tax system. So you're bringing them into a tax system that treats them as if they were an adult beneficiary, independent of the member.
Yeah, and possibly some frustration from beneficiaries not receiving what's due to them as soon as it might otherwise.
Now there are some exceptions around death in service, but I think even there's going to be we're going to start seeing this in the newspapers from 2027, when we find that somebody wasn't working, they were working, they died, and they're finding now that the family are paying inheritance tax on part of the lump sum that they would be receiving.
Quite a lot of detail to work through.
Yeah, keeps us busy.
Certainly. Let's step back to the salary sacrifice then, and we'll just sort of dig through a bit of the details. I guess the first thing is that's due to come in from 2029.
Yep.
So we've got
really long lead time for a government measure.
It seems to be, doesn't it? Which I guess I assume they received a fair bit of pushback from some of the practicalities around this potentially, or is it just corporates looking to defer costs? I don't know. Why do you think it might be taking so long?
I'm not sure, because you think about it, they gave us about just over a year's notice to abolish the lifetime allowance system. And in fact, they couldn't actually do it in time, and a lot of the legislation went through afterwards. This is a long time. I think the Chancellor was perhaps stung by the criticism when she raised national insurance on employers last year, and there wasn't a lot of notice. That came in this April.
Yeah.
This is several years away. I think it's fair to say that there is a national insurance rise on employers here, but they're being given time to adapt to that, plan for that, to take that into account with their workforce planning.
Good news for them, I guess. It's at least not coming in next April. I guess, first of all, in terms of salary sacrifice, I think it's worth it. Would you mind just explaining again how that works generally?
Of course, right. So I think we're all familiar with the idea of income tax. You get a tax on your income. That includes your wages. It also includes pensions, rental income, all sorts of things. But earnings are taxed differently. Now, by earnings, wages is the starting point, but it is a bit more complicated than that. But think about the wages we receive that's different than the pension we will receive when we retire. It's effectively a payroll tax. National insurance is a payroll tax on both the employee and on the employer. So normally I get paid my wages, I pay income tax, and I pay national insurance. And I can put some money into my pension. I automatically will get income tax relief, right? So the pension contribution will come out before my income tax is calculated. But it doesn't come out my earnings from national insurance. Okay? That's the starting point. That's what's happening in, say, public sector schemes. That's the norm.
Yeah. Okay.
The employer pays there's no income tax for the employer to pay. That's my tax. It does have to pay national insurance on the pay it gives me on my earnings. And it doesn't have to pay national insurance on the contributions it pays into my scheme. So from an employer point of view, there's a distinct tax advantage, a national insurance advantage, to be precise, of putting money into my pension rather than paying me.
Okay.
And that gap, so we've got a gap there. Employer contributions, no NI. Employee contributions, we've got the NI. So people have seen that gap over time and said, oh, actually, wouldn't it be good for the employee and the employer if we paid this person a little bit less and just up the contributions into their scheme? And indeed, people have seen that, and the savings can be substantial, particularly in the larger private sector organisations where this tends to happen. And that's been increasing for many years.
And most of that saving is on the employer side, isn't it? So if we talk about the percentages.
That's right. Employer rates of national insurance are higher than the members in broad terms. Members are paying typically 2%, 8% of national insurance, whereas the employer is generally paying 15% of the money we're talking about.
And that came up this April, didn't it, following the previous budget? So probably, even more of an NI saving as things currently stand.
Yeah.
And then how's the capping going to work then?
So the capping says, well, you can carry on doing that. That's fine up to a point. And what the Chancellor is saying is, look, if we're talking about the ordinary member here sacrificing a few £100 or indeed up to £2,000, fine, as you were. Okay, so there's still quite a tax incentive there left for the member to put more money into the scheme, but also for the employer to be. I guess it's an incentive for employers to actually encourage people to pay into the scheme. It's one of the few incentives there is for employers to do that.
I guess the last thing this government would want is to take people who are not on large incomes and reduce the incentive for them to save into a pension.
But it's saying for the higher earners and who are actually not necessarily getting a huge national insurance benefit themselves because they're only paying 2% on sort of earnings much beyond £50,000. But that's where the employer is making a lot of savings.
Yeah, that 15%.
And on the 15% on those big high earner contributions, they're saying that excess bit, once you pass the first £2,000, what we'll do there is we'll basically add that back to your earnings. So you'll still get the income tax relief, but it will start to come through the national insurance again. Yeah,
okay. And in terms of, I guess, breaking it down to groups of members who might see different impacts here, so should we talk through those? So if we talk about, I guess, let's say people at or near the minimum wage, are they affected by this?
Well, actually, the way that the minimum wage operates, it actually prevents sacrifice. So you've got to make sure once you've done your salary sacrifice, that is your wages, they still need to be above the minimum wage. So for a full-timer, you need to be earning something in the region of, say, £24,000 a year in order to be able to give up something like a 5% of your wages and still earn above the minimum wage. So that group are not in salary sacrifice at all. There's a group above that earning high 20-something a year or £30,000 a year, that kind of area. They will be able to carry on unaffected, effectively.
Yeah, because they wouldn't normally pay more than the £2,000.
They wouldn't be normally making that level of contribution unless they'd individually decided to put up their contributions. The first group to get affected as we move up the income scale, particularly, are the people earning towards but not quite at the high rate tax threshold.
Yeah, okay.
They're getting that 8% national insurance relief, and their contributions in many cases will exceed £2,000. So they'll get some relief, but from this, but not all of it.
Yeah.
And then the funny thing is, once you then start to get into the higher rate tax earnings level, that member's only paying 2% national insurance. So they will be capped, but it won't make a huge amount of difference to their take-home pay. I mean, even on 5% of six-figure earnings could only be a national insurance impact of a few pounds a week. But for the employer, it's a much bigger number. For every £1,000 the employee has sacrificed, that's a direct £150 saving, a 15% saving for the employer.
So for pretty much all employees, other than those close to the minimum wage, it's the impact of this is mostly felt by the employer.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in terms of a member and sort of the individual saver level, it's mostly people on that sort of middle income of around £40,000-50,000 who are going to feel the hit of this.
There are some. I mean, that's the standard position. The great thing about doing a podcast about national insurance and all this kind of thing is you can say that's the general position. There's huge amounts of detail that experts listening to this will be shouting at me for. For example, sacrificing affects student loan repayments, for example. So those people might still be quite keen individually to sacrifice, even though the national insurance impact on them is not that big.
Yes, because there are other things that salary sacrifice is used for, and those don't seem to have been touched, do they?
No, all the stuff we've read in the government's red book, that's the budget book, and the OBR report, is all talking about pension salary sacrifice. There was a bit of chatter before the budget about whether sacrificing for bikes or electric cars might be reined in. I've not seen any reference to that yet. It all seems to be about pension contributions.
Yeah, so still some good reasons for people to salary sacrifice for in addition to their pension. And I guess in terms of today's headlines, is there anything that you'd be thinking that, I guess sponsoring employers or trustees of pension schemes ought to immediately be doing, other than sort of genning up and make sure they understand what's coming?
Well, I think there'll be some reflection on how those two big measures, the sacrificing measures and the surplus payment measures, are going to pan out. I imagine that there's a lot of employment lawyers thinking how, if at all, can we mitigate some of this loss of salary sacrifice advantage for the employers. I mean, the government's already aware of that. There were some remarks in the Red Book that it doesn't want to allow employers to renegotiate contracts individually to work around this. They have thought about that, but quite how they draw the line on that and make that work, I think, will be very, very interesting work.
Yeah, interesting times ahead. Okay. Glyn, any closing comments before we conclude the episode?
Yeah, I suppose we should try and end on an upbeat note, because we've talked about reduction in national insurance advantages and we've talked about some inheritance tax extension as well. But I would just focus on what's still there. We've still got those income tax advantages. We've still got the tax-free lump sum. So still lots of tax advantages towards pension saving for retirement.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Thank you, Glyn.
You're welcome.
And thank you to our listeners for joining today's special episode. And hopefully you can join us for a future recording as well. Thanks for listening. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. The views expressed by any hosts and guests are their own and may not reflect those of their employers or affiliated organisations. All content is protected by copyright.